We saw yesterday that if I have an API in which I've enabled CORS using the library Microsoft.AspNet.WebApi.Cors, I've enabled CORS and disallowed requests from any domain other than satyaish.net. But if I have a client that is disallowed, if the client does not send any special headers, this is the client code. This client makes an AJAX request to the API without sending any headers. If it sends no special headers at all, as per the CORS rules, the browser does not upgrade it to a pre-flight request. It instead sends a simple request to the browser, which is fine, which works as per the CORS same origin policy rules. But the API lets that request go through. The server-side implementation of the library, CORS library, lets that request go through. And our intention is to not let that request go through. Otherwise, it defeats the whole purpose of CORS, of the same origin policy. So to demonstrate that, this is the client. I'll make a request, and it does hit the API, even though the client localhost 8088 is not on the list of whitelisted domains. This does hit the API and runs successfully. And even then, even though the request is successful and we get a successful response, the browser pretends not to have gotten a successful response. It actually hides the response from your script and generates an error in the script. This is the behavior we saw yesterday. Now, before we go and fix the server-side code, let's analyze why this error is in the library. What's the root cause? Let's get into the code of the server-side library so that we can then fix that code. So to do that, I will stop the server and let's poke around the server to see where the error is. Obviously, the only line of code that's relevant to the library that I have is this line. In fact, these two lines, but that's the class I want to get into and inspect. Let's look at this class. Let's have a closer look. I'll do a go to definition or go to reference by pressing F12. And I see that this class is in this namespace and in this library. So I'm going to look for this library. This is the path where I'll find this library. I'll open this in a decompiler. Let's have a look at the source code of this method that we're calling. We're calling the method enable CORS on the HTTP configuration class. But this is definitely not a method that comes out of the box of ASP.NET. It definitely has got to be added by this library. To check that, let me do a F12 on this method. And I see, yes, that this method also comes from this library. And it's in the class system it's in the namespace system web HTTP, and it's in a static class called this one, and it's an extension. So I'm going to go and look for, in this library, I'm going to look for this namespace, and over here I find this class, and I find this method and its overloads over here. I'm calling the one that accepts this iCORS policy provider. So let me look at the source for this guy. This obviously calls the other overload that has more parameters, or it has a Boolean parameter. And this is some code that we want to understand. This is probably where something is happening. So let's understand this. To understand any code, the approach I'm going to follow is I'm going to copy paste this code and bring it into a file in Visual Studio just so I can read it better. It's not a file we're going to include in the project. I'll just create a file that I will delete later. I'll call this delete later. delete this later. And I'll copy and paste this method here just so I can dissect this method. I'm not going to worry about these namespace errors. But what this method is doing is, okay, it gets an argument, it checks if the argument is not null and throws an exception. I'm not interested in this. If some default policy provider, and don't worry, this is this argument, I.Cors policy provider. Okay, let me actually bring a reference to this. This is an interface within the library that we want to inspect. So I'll add this reference momentarily. All this file anyway is something I'm going to delete later. In fact, let me fix all the references. I'm anyway going to delete this file. Why is it complaining? Oh yeah, this is an extension method. So this extensions can only be in classes that are static and public. So I'll just make this class static for now. It doesn't really matter. And it can't find this method, which is fine because I haven't copied all of the code from the library. It's fine. All I want to do is understand this code and then throw it away. So it looks for this argument. This is the argument that we supplied over here. This class, this is an instance of this class, and this class implements I.Cors policy provider. So this argument is named default policy provider, and this code is checking if that's not null, then do something. And regardless of whether it was null or not, after you've done this thing, do this thing. So let's see, this is not null in our case, so this is going to be executed. What's this? Blah 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 factory. Obviously, you know, if you're a programmer with some number of years of experience or some amount of practice, a factory, this is a factory, which means it's a class that creates an object of whatever this is. A policy provider, an attribute based policy provider. Our class is an attribute based policy provider. Why is that? Because it's an attribute. I'll go to the definition of this class. It is an attribute and it is a policy provider in the sense that it provides the policy regarding cors. So the factory class, this is some kind of a factory class that's supposed to create an instance of this guy. We've already created the instance, but this is some administrative code. Let's see what this is doing. It's just saying if you need a factory at all, let me new up a factory and give it to you. So it news up a factory, and in the factory it sets the default policy provider as the one we passed in, which is the enable cors attribute. Now this isn't any fun. This is not really doing anything or helping us in any way. It's basically setting an object. It's anchoring whatever argument we passed someplace so it can use it later. And then it passes that same argument to, it passes this factory to the HTTP environment. That's the general HTTP environment that has all kinds of information about the HTTP pipeline. And that obviously has some method which looks again like an extension method from this library, but I'm not going to bother going into this one. All this probably does is set the factory, provider factory, to this factory. So this is, for all of our purposes, it's pretty pointless. I mean, it's not completely pointless, but it's not something we would be interested in going further or delving into. This is administrivia. This is not something that we are interested in right now. So this is probably something that we want to get into. So HTTP configuration doesn't have this method out of the box. So this must be an extension, add cors message handler. And it just passes a Boolean value to that. I'm sure this is not something we are interested in. This, from the name, suggests that if there's an error while doing this thing, whatever this thing is, then rethrow that exception to the caller. And by default, I'm sure this is going to be false. So let's just ignore this for a moment. Our focus should be on what's inside this guy. Let's go inside that guy. This guy. I'll go into this method. Okay, reflector doesn't like this. So let me open this in ILSpy. I've got this assembly open in ILSpy. I'm going to go to this class and this method add.Cors message handler, and this seems like something that might tell us something. So what this message does is it says I've received an HTTP configuration and some nonsense thing we're not interested in. I've just told you what this means, and this is the environment, and it says get the properties of this environment and try and get a value blah 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 blah. If that thing doesn't exist, then do something, and that something is a lot of something, and at the end set this in the properties, set this key. So this looks like a mandatory thing that is going to be done anyway. It's checking for the presence of some key and at the end putting that key. Doesn't look like something that might interest us, but let's pay a closer look. Let's give it a closer look. But let's give it a closer look of what this actually is doing. What is this? Inside the if construct. What's the thing inside the if construct? I'm interested in that. So I'll just copy this whole method so I can dissect it and paste it in our class. I'll delete this method. We're done with this guy. And it says yada yada yada. I'm not interested in any of that if construct thing, so I'll delete the if construct. And it basically sets this key, which I'm not interested in. So the first thing it does is it says if the configuration has an initializer, get that initializer and put it in this default initializer, then do something, then set that same initializer to this delegate that I've passed you. So I want to just look at this delegate. So basically what it's doing is it's replacing the default initializer in the HTTP configuration with something of its own. Let's look at what that thing is. So what is it asking HTTP configuration to do at the time of initialization? This thing. And what is this? It's checking again, does the properties have this guy? If it doesn't have this guy, then do something, do this thing. And at the end of it, reinstall or call the default initializer that was before this replacement was made. So this is invoking the default initializer. I'm not interested in looking at this. It says if this key doesn't exist, then do something. I'm not interested in this if construct. Let's just get inside this and see what exactly is it that it's doing. In fact, let me delete all of this. All I'm interested in is understanding what this is. Okay, the first line says to the config, to the HTTP configuration, which is now named config. It's the same as this guy. Get the message handler's property. Get the getter. This is the getter for the message handler's property. And to that, add a new message handler with these two arguments, the HTTP configuration and this guy. Okay, let's park this for a moment. I don't know if this is important or not. We'll come back to this later. Then get a trace writer, and if it's not null, write something, something, something. Get the factory, do the blah, blah, blah administrivia. This is administrivia, I can tell you. So this is not important. I'm definitely certain that this is the thing that we want to look into. In fact, to the message handlers, we want to look into this whole line. So let's go to this whole line and see what exactly is happening here. This seems to be like a collection of something, and this is a message handler that's being added to the collection. And even from the name, it suggests, it looks like this might be the handler for something. This might be the actual code that does something. Okay, so let's look at this line of code in ILSpy. This line of code is over here. So let's check what this is. Message handlers looks like a collection. Okay, it hasn't loaded the assembly that has this. So let me look at why it hasn't loaded it. There's three assemblies that it could not load. One is system.net.http formatting. One is this. Let's load all of these. System web HTTP. I'll go to my project. I'll go to my API, look for system.net or web. Was it system.web? System.web.http. I'll look for this. I'll look at the path from where to get this. I'll copy this path. I'll go here. I'll say please open this guy. I'll go back to the DLL that I was looking at. That was the method I was looking at. And I'll see the next library. I'll do the same thing for this library, system.web.Cors. That one. I'll copy this path. I'll load it. And the third one was system.net HTTP formatting. And let's go back to this method now. And let's reload this assembly. And if you go back to that method, now it doesn't show us any errors. So now we should be able to enter this guy. Look, even the appearance changed from the getter to just message handlers. Now I can go and check what this is. Okay, this comes from this assembly, and it's a property. It's a read-only property that has this value, and it's a collection of delegating handlers. It's a collection of delegating handlers. What is this? This is a kind of HTTP message handler. Now, what is that? I read the documentation before doing this video, and I'll just save you all the trouble and the time and tell you what this is. An HTTP message handler is basically a unit or an entity that is not necessarily an HTTP module, but it is very similar to an HTTP module. It's not really an HTTP module in that it's not a separate assembly, it's not a separate thing, but these are all of these are, this is a thing that you can plug into the HTTP pipeline either before the request is processed by the server or after it has been, after you've received a response from the server, you want to add something to the response. So you know that there is an HTTP pipeline, and like all pipelines, in fact, this is something that is a parallel to things like, all these are manifestations of plugins into a pipeline. The things I'm going to list down are manifestations of the same idea. They may be different in nuances or in some kind of appearance, but essentially, functionally, they are things you can plug into a pipeline. Examples of pipelines and their plugins are the HTTP pipeline itself has HTTP modules which you can add into the pipeline and they'll take care of something. HTTP handlers are not really plugins, but they handle specific kinds of extensions, and this is not that, but the other kinds of handlers that you can plug into an HTTP pipeline or any kind of pipeline, you know, ISAPI filters, HTTP modules, action filters in MVC, or you know, the link pipeline has these enumerable extensions or queryable extensions. All these are plugins into a kind of pipeline you build. It's the chain of responsibility, not technically the chain of responsibility, but somewhat similar to the chain of responsibility design pattern. The difference is that in the chain of responsibility, the input of one has to be passed to the next one, which it which is exactly what happens here, but the that has a structure. Chain of responsibility has a rigid structure which is not followed by these plugins. So I was giving you an example of other kinds of plugins and other kinds of pipelines. You know, the link pipeline or the PowerShell pipeline that allows you to pipe different commands on the command line via CLR objects that are passed from one entity to another, or the WCF pipeline where you can add services like formatters and decompressors and compressors and and um, encryption services and all that kind of stuff before the message gets to the server and after the response is received from the server. Um, so it's kind of one of those objects. It's or the Windows message pump, the WinProc is another example of a pipeline. In fact, everything is a pipeline. Mostly, most server-side processing is built as a pipeline, and so the or the Oven Katana implementation of Microsoft or Node.js, wherein you add Express.js in between. These are all examples of pipelines, and these are plugins. So this is a basic unit that indicates that indicates a plugin that can do something to a message before it is sent to the server. And our delegating handler was a specialized kind of message handler. So in a nutshell, it's basically something that can do something to the HTTP request before it is sent to the server. And so this line of code is saying, to the list of such handlers that can do something to an HTTP request before it hits the web server, meaning before it hits your application code, please attach these handlers. So this line of code was really saying, what is that? This line of code was saying, this is the most important line of code that we need to pay attention to. It's saying, wait. The user wants to attach something to the HTTP pipeline. This is the soul of what we're doing over here. Over here, what we did just now is we just attached something to the HTTP pipeline that will be used later on when the actual request for a resource hits our server. So this code actually right now won't be doing anything other than attaching something to the HTTP pipeline. And this is the line that does it. It says, to all the message handlers that will do something, that will intercept the HTTP request and get in between and do something, please add this guy. And so this guy must be the critical component that we need to look into. So let's go and see what this guy does. And this is of the type I'm expecting a delegating handler. This guy, as it is appropriately named, it is Cors message handler. This is the handler that does Cors related stuff. And all delegating handlers, which are of type message handlers, have these methods. Let's look at these methods. This is a protected constructor, so no need to pay attention to this. Protected, public, disposable. I think dispose and disposable, you know what they are, not important. There's a constructor, so this is the only method that we need to pay attention to, a method called send async. This probably does the job. Look at the environment, look at the arguments. It takes the request and it's probably going to do something before it sends the request back into the HTTP pipeline, which means to the next message handler. And then there's a cancellation token, like all cancellation API. If the caller wants to cancel the operation in flight, they can pass this cancellation token. But the crux of the matter is, this is the guy we want to look into on the class Cors message handler. Let's go back and do that. Let's see. This class's send method must be the magic voodoo that happens that we're interested in. So what does this actually do? Let's pay attention to that method. I'll go to this class Cors message handler and I'll go to the send async message. Okay, let's look at this code. This is the bread and butter. This is the meat and potatoes of what we're after. I'll just fix all the references momentarily because otherwise okay, that's enough of reference fixing. I'm not going to fix the other ones which relate to the other code in the same class, Cors message handler. For that, I'll have to copy the whole class and maybe other related classes. So let's stop it at this. Okay, what this message does is it says get the Cors request context. From the request, get the Cors request context. Context simply means any related information. So let's go and see what this actually gets. I'm guessing, without looking at it, I'm guessing it just gets everything that's in the request, meaning the request headers. What headers came with the request? What was the method of the request? What was the body of the request? Yada yada yada. Everything to do with the request. What was the URL of the request? Basically, and anything Cors related. Only Cors related. So not the whole shebang, not the whole request, which is already there in the request object. But anything related that's important as far as a Cors transaction is concerned. So this should get you the Cors specific headers. So this method is, I'm guessing it's going to search for, are there any allow access origin related headers, like allow access origin method, allow access origin header, allow access origins, or those kinds of methods. Let's actually go inside the method and look at what it does. Yada yada yada, null check, yada yada, not interested in all this. Okay, so that's exactly what it's checking. It's saying, does the headers contain, does the request headers contain a origin, a header named origin? If it does, if it doesn't, go back and tell them I don't like you, which is generate an error or something. Otherwise, make a context object, attach to it the request URI, the method, yada yada yada. Get the origin header and get the access control request header. This guy. So basically, it just makes up an object that has the headers that these headers. These are Cors related headers. Access control request headers. Yeah, just get any of these headers and any of these Cors related headers and put them in an object and return that object as this guy. In fact, if you look at this guy, it has access control request method, access control request headers, the origin header, and so on and so forth. So basically, send method, getting back to the send method, this gets us the context, and if the context is not null, then do something. What's that thing? If the request is a pre-flight request, meaning if it is an options method, see, if the origin is not null and the requested method is not null, then a request is a pre-flight request if its HTTP method equals this guy, the options. So a request is a pre-flight request if it is the options method. So it says if it is a pre-flight request, do something. Otherwise, if it's a normal, do something and return. Otherwise, this means otherwise. Let me go back to this guy. So it says if it is a pre-flight request, do this thing, whatever this thing is. We'll get into this later. Otherwise, if it's not a pre-flight request, if it's the main request, I think this is what we're more interested in because it handles the pre-flight scenario perfectly fine. We'll look into both of these, but I'm guessing this is what we're actually after. And then this is nothing. If you want exceptions rethrown, I'll rethrow them, otherwise I'll handle them. And then call the next guy in the chain. Alright, so this looks like something we'll just look into cursorily, but this looks like what we are after. So let's go into each of these methods to see. This simply out of curiosity, and this one out of the interest of changing it. Let's go into this method. And this checks, if it's an options request, obviously what is it going to check? It's going to check if it has any of these headers, an access control request method. If it doesn't have it, send a bad request. Does it have does it have, get the CORS policy and check everything against the CORS policy, otherwise create an error response. Otherwise, if everything is okay, write the CORS headers, which are these are the allowed methods, these are the allowed origins, and these are the allowed headers. So that's what it writes back as the CORS response to the options request. So just as expected, this is a normal method. It's behaving perfectly fine. I think this is the guy we're after. Not this guy. This guy is the one that handles the actual post request, and it does it badly. So this is really, I think, the end of our chase. We're very near to the destination. Let's look at this method, see what it actually does. Okay. It gets a request. It gets a CORS context, request context, and a cancellation token. This is a simple null check. These two are null checks. And let's look at the other lines. This is just a return thing. Okay, it says send the message to the next guy in the pipeline and get me a response. I think that's the bloody trouble. That's the main culprit. Before doing anything itself, it's like a result filter in MVC. It says, go do the thing, get all the other message handlers in the pipeline, let them do their thing, just get me the response, and after everything has happened, I'll do something. I think that's the bloody error. That's the culprit. We got it. This should happen conditionally, only if everything is fine. Otherwise, this should not be done. And then it says, get me the CORS policy, which is the thing we specified. So this CORS policy, I'm guessing, is going to be an implementation of I-CORS policy provider or something related. The things we specified, which is going to hold a reference to the allowed origins and the allowed methods and the allowed headers. And I'm going to go into this method, but it's understandable that this is exactly what the policy means. And then it says if the policy is not null, which is a good check, but I'm going to remove it in order to focus on the real stuff. Then evaluate the policy, and only if the policy evaluation returns a boolean true, then write the CORS headers. This is where the problem is. Otherwise, and after you've written the CORS headers, whether or not things were evaluated according to the policy, just return the response as it is. This whole method needs a change. What we need to do is, we need to not do this at all. First, we need to get the policy. We need to evaluate it. If it is evaluated correctly, then only we need to write these headers. Before writing these headers, now we can allow the response. We can allow the rest of the handlers in the pipeline to give us the actual response. Here is where we are allowing our API code to be executed. And then we get the response, and then we write the headers. And if this policy is not evaluated correctly, we need to send not the response. We need to send, in fact, we need to send this response only if the policy was evaluated. If it was not evaluated, I need to send a bad request. An HTTP, what does this return? A task that returns an HTTP response message. And I think there is a message called bad request. I don't know what it's called. I think there's some kind of message that returns, there's some kind of child class that returns a bad HTTP error response, I think it's called. We'll look at that. I need to send a bad request over here. I think that should be roughly the skeleton structure of our code. Before we do this, let's actually double check if this is the method that we are interested in. And the way to do that is, I'm going to delete this file now. I'll simply comment it for now. The way to double check that is, I'll just run the code The code isn't doing anything right now other than setting this handler. All right. To check that, I will set two breakpoints. One at the actual API and one at this method inside the .NET assemblies, .NET code. So I'm interested in the method send async from the class Cors message handler, which is in the namespace. That's the class. In the namespace, what's this namespace? System.web.http.cors. I'm interested in this guy's send async method. So let me set a breakpoint. I'll close this. I'll set another breakpoint. I'll go to debug and say Windows and breakpoints, or I can just say new breakpoint. And I want to set a functional breakpoint at this dot send async. I'll say OK. And I just want to run the code to see if our assumption that that's the important method, send async is the one that we need to change, if that assumption is correct, then before it hits this, the first thing is while initialization, it should hit this, and then it should do nothing at this time. Then when we actually send the request from the client, it should first hit the send method on the Cors message handler, and only after that it should come to this guy. Remember, we haven't fixed the code yet. I'm still running the wrong code. I just want to check or double check if that's the sequence of events that happens. So I've set the I've set the breakpoint. Let me run this code. It's first going to hit our initialization enable Cors attribute line, which happens at the very start of the API, just one time in the whole lifetime of the application. There it is. It's hit our enable Cors attribute, and this line will never be hit again. Our API is up and running. Let's go to the client and make that request. There's our client. I'm going to make a request. I'm expecting the first thing it's going to do is hit the send async method on the Cors message handler code within the library code. That screen says the source is not available for the DLL you set the breakpoint on because I couldn't download the source, or you don't have the debug symbols. Now this is suggestive of the fact that it's actually on the send method, but you can double check that by going to the breakpoints window, and you see right now, where is the breakpoint? Is it on this guy? Where is it exactly? This should have been bold if it was over here, but to double check, I can remove these breakpoints. I can remove this one. Actually, I don't have to remove this one. I'll remove this one. I'll go to the module that this guy. Let's just look at the modules window. It's called system.http.cors, system.web.http.cors. Yep, the symbols have been loaded. Before I started Visual Studio, I actually downloaded all the symbols. So the symbols have been downloaded, but Visual Studio has a problem. It doesn't step into the .NET source any longer. This happened like with Visual Studio 2013 or somewhere. Periodically I've posted questions on Stack Overflow about this, and somebody confirmed that this is something that Visual Studio doesn't do very well now. And so the .NET guys haven't bothered, Microsoft guys haven't bothered to get Visual Studio to step into the .NET source all the time, even if the symbols are loaded. But anyway, suffice it to say that this is the method we've broken into because we've only got two breakpoints. The other one is this one, and it hasn't broken here yet. So it's broken at this one. Oh, the other way to check it is go to the call stack. Let's look at the call stack. That's the proof of the pudding. Look at the call stack, and the top entry is indeed the send async method on the Cors message handler in this namespace. So there we are. We're at this breakpoint, And now if I continue, it's going to go into our code after this. Therefore, our assumption was indeed right, that that's the method we need to aim at. We need to target that method. Now, in the next video, I will write the code to fix that bug. But remember, we have tentatively written the bug fix, but implementing that bug fix is not going to be as simple as this. And in the next video, I'll show you why, what the challenges are. There are some private variables in the class that we don't have access to. But let's save all of that for the next video. I'll see you soon.
बाद में थोड़ा उन्होंने पढ़ना शुरू कर दिया।
दरअसल ढाई अक्षर
प्रेम का पढ़े सो पंडित हो।
आप वो बात क्या?
बस वही बात है। और संसार में जो इस बात को समझ जाएगा वो शायद यहाँ कुछ करके जाएगा, यो अच्छा जीवन जी के जाएगा, लोगों के लिए कुछ छोड़ के जाएगा। और ये बातें नहीं समझेगा तो ठीक है, अपने बच्चों के लिए कुछ कर सकता है या परिवार के लिए कुछ कर सकता है, लोगों के लिए कुछ नहीं कर सकता और अपने लिए कुछ नहीं कर सकता। वैसे ही मर जाएगा दौड़ता भागता हुआ, संतुष्टि उसको मिलेगी नहीं। सानू एक पल चैन न आवे, सानू एक पल चैन न आवे, सजना तेरे बिना, सजना तेरे बिना। सानू एक पल चैन न आवे, सानू एक पल चैन न आवे, सजना तेरे बिना, सजना तेरे बिना। साडा कलियां दी नहीं ओ लगना, साडा कलियां दी नहीं ओ लगना, सजना तेरे बिना, सजना तेरे बिना, सजना तेरे सबसे बड़ी बात है इंसान का दिल। अपन गलत काम करेंगे ना तो दिल अपने को मना करेगा जरूर, ये गलत कर रहे हो, और वही धर्म है। मैं तो कहता हूँ बिछड़े यार जिना दे सानू।